Welcome to Navigating Life with Vision Loss, an Aftersight original podcast. In each episode, we share stories, insights, and practical advice to help you navigate the journey of living with low vision or blindness. Together, we'll embrace each step with courage, grace, and hope.
Hello, this is Kim Wardlow, your host for NLVL. Welcome back. It's been a bit. It's been a few months since our last show. I hope that you've enjoyed some of our previous podcasts. We're able to catch up maybe on some that you hadn't heard, some episodes. But welcome back to our new series, our new format. Just a reminder, or in case you didn't know, this year in 2025, we'll be doing two 16-week series. And today is the first episode of our first series, which is going to cover a variety of aspects related to advocacy. And where better to start than the basics, Advocacy 101, the basics of advocacy. So, I'm so excited to have as our guest today, Angela Winfield. Angela is a renowned attorney, a motivational speaker, an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's been recognized as one of the nation's top influencers in disability rights and serves as a role model in the blind community. She completely lost her sight by the age of 20, but graduated from two Ivy League institutions. She reached her goal of passing the bar and becoming a practicing attorney. She's a published author, a community leader, and a successful entrepreneur. And she did all this before reaching the age of 30. So welcome, Angela. I'm so excited to have you on our program and talking about the basics of advocacy.
Oh, Kim, well, I am so delighted to be with you, and I'm just honored and thrilled to get the opportunity to have a chat with you.
Well, I think the expertise you bring, both just your personal experience of advocating for yourself as a low vision and then blind individual, as well as your legal background, really will help our listeners learn some new things about advocacy and the different types of advocacy, just to introduce this series. You've just had so many achievements, but you weren't always advocating for yourself. And certainly as an attorney, you advocate for others. I know you had mentioned to our podcast producer, Jonathan, that sometimes it's easier to advocate for others than yourself. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your journey from being a child with low vision and blind to where you are today, kind of being a leader in the community?
Absolutely. And it has been quite a journey because you are right, Kim. I was not always an advocate and certainly not an advocate for myself. So growing up is where I will start. And I was classified legally blind when I was 10 years old. So I lost the sight totally in my left eye, and I had some vision, but not great vision. I think it was 2400 or something like that in my right eye. And at that time, I was very shy. And I can't emphasize how shy I was because I was very just a timid child at that point. And I did not advocate for myself, right? I relied on my parents, and I owe a lot to them. They were both public school teachers, and they were both public school teachers in my district. So I watched them advocate for me, right? I watched them work with guidance counselors and teachers in the district. And it wasn't until I got into junior high and high school when I realized that, mom and dad aren't always going to be here for me to fight these fights. And somehow I was going to have to learn how to do that myself. And that was a difficult journey. And we can certainly get into that if you want. But, you probably know middle school, high school years are not fun for anybody. But when you're going...
Those are hard just to start with.
Yes, exactly. And then when you're dealing with this extra stuff, it gets even more difficult. But where I started to really begin to come into my own around advocacy is when I got into college, and actually when I lost the rest of my sight and went totally blind, because that forced me to step in and say, hey, what does this mean to be a blind woman? How do I want to navigate the world? And who's going to stand up for me? So that's a little bit of how I began the journey to advocating for myself versus advocating for others, which I knew I wanted to be an attorney from very young age.
Right. Well, and as I recall, as I was reviewing your discussion with Jonathan, you kind of had an aha moment in college when you came back from studying overseas in the airport, and you realized, wow,
Yes.
This is something I need to do for myself.
Yes. And so in my junior year, it was the spring semester of my junior year, I wanted to study abroad for like so long. Like this was a dream of mine.
Mm-hmm.
I remember going my first semester of college, going to speak with the study abroad dean, and she's like,
Yep.
"Why don't you get used to being here on campus first before you start planning to leave?" And I was like, "But I really want to do this." So
I know. I did the same thing.
did you do the right?
I did. I can identify with that.
Because planning is so important, right? It's like you've got to
Right.
plan. So I was like, no, I'm just trying to be prepared. And by the time I actually ended up going abroad, I went from being, legally blind, where I used a cane in unfamiliar circumstances, to being totally blind, where I used a cane all the time because I had to. So I went off, had this wonderful, wonderful experience in London, like really grew into my own independence, got really confident and comfortable being a blind woman. And on my flight back, I was coming through Newark Airport, and I just landed. My parents were picking me up. And this is a common thing that happens to a lot of low vision and blind people when you're in airports. They want to put you in a wheelchair, right? And they're like, would you sit in this wheelchair? And I was like, no, I am not going to sit in this wheelchair. Like, this is not how I'm going to end this 6-month experience of independence, is being wheeled out to my parents. Absolutely not. I'm walking, and I can walk. And that was my first real kind of bold stance advocating for myself.
So you kind of started that journey. Could you define advocacy for
Yes.
our audience?
Yes. And this is where I go into my kind of brainy academia type world, where I talk about Latin. But like advocate, it literally comes from the Latin vocar, right? Vocare, right? To voice. And that's what advocacy is about. It's about giving voice to the things that are unsaid, or the things that need to be said, right? So, and there are different ways of being an advocate and different styles of advocacy that I think are really important and really valid. Like, it's okay sometimes to be a rabble rouser, right? To be the one that is, protesting and really, loud and giving proud, loud voice to an issue. And then there are times when it's okay, right? And it's an okay style to be a more collaborative, right? A more willing partner in figuring out how to make change. That's also advocacy. It's not just vinegar. It's not just honey. Like, you've got to know when to use which tool in the right circumstances.
Why is advocacy so critical for creating inclusive spaces and policies?
Oh, that's an excellent, excellent question, Kim. I think advocacy is important for a number of reasons, but one of the key reasons why advocacy is so important is because there's a lot that often goes unsaid, unseen, unheard in these rooms when it comes to policy. And most of it is not malicious, right? Most of it is because they're not thinking about all of the experiences that are out there, and because policymakers are often not thinking about blind and visually impaired and low vision folks, right? It's just not on their minds. So if there's an opportunity, right, to give voice, to say, hey, no, there are actually people out here who experience this, and this is their lived experience and their life experience, we should factor this in, That is why advocacy is so important. It's literally giving voice to the lived experiences of others, the needs of others, and how policy impacts us as members of the blind and visually impaired community. And I think you can do that both on an individual level, but you can also do that more broadly to impact the BVI community at large.
So sometimes I think as individuals, we see advocates out in the community, and often maybe, the style that is a louder, bigger style. And we just think, wow, those are kind of superhero people. And I'm not that. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. I had wrote down a note, and I'm not sure if I have the quote completely correct, but you had said the best advocates know their passions, their strengths, their weaknesses, no cape required.
Oh, that's a good quote. I said that.
You said that, and I loved it. You said that,
Well,
and I thought that's so true, because we feel like, oh, well, I'm not, the super brave person. I don't know everything. What if I'm asked a question I don't know? But just could you talk a little bit about that? Like, you don't have to. There are different styles and different ways to advocate, and different types of advocacy, as you said, and maybe expand on those a little bit more for our audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think the best advocates, and I guess before I even get into that, what I need to say is that the various different styles of advocacy are needed, right? They work together, right? So you have the people who are going to go in and say, I don't want to sit at the table. I want to turn over the table. I want to dismantle the table, and we're going to build something new, right? That's one mode of advocacy, and that's needed. Then there's another mode of advocacy where someone says, no, I want a seat at the table. I'm not trying to change the table. I just want to have a seat at the table and be a part of this and contribute to what's happening here. And then there are other people who are not even in the room, but they're doing quiet advocacy all around and outside the room and building those relationships. So I think there's at least 3 levels of advocacy, and probably many, many more, but this is an oversimplification of it. And all of them are needed, and all of them kind of work together and are kind of cooperative, right? Because you need someone to disrupt, right? But then you also need the folks to be in and say, yep, I know they're disrupting, and I'm going to help you, right? I'm going to help you figure out a policy that works for folks in the BVI community. And then you've got folks out in the community who are actually just living it and teaching it and being it. So I think there are those levels. But when it really comes down to it, I think that when you have this kind of commitment to access, right? And even if it's access for you, or access for your parent or your child or your loved one or your friend, that it does not need to be big at all, right? There's this thing about your locus of control, right? The places where you show up, and the places in your community or the places in your work, right? Where you actually have voice. And where you can bring in ways to be more inclusive, that is also advocacy. And that is also really, really important. So it does not need to be this big, bold, brash, loud version of advocacy, even though that's welcomed, right? It can be a more low-key advocacy where you're making change in your everyday life, in your everyday roles, where you're helping to make sure that blind and visually impaired people can be included, or where you're advocating for yourself in small ways, even if it's, in terms of getting an Uber, or negotiating at a doctor's office or the grocery store, or all these little ways are small bits of advocacy And it's all very, very important. And absolutely, it's about self-awareness, right? So it's knowing where you're passionate, right? Because that's where you're going to be the best advocate, where you have a natural interest and passion for it. It's about knowing your strengths and weaknesses, right? So some people are great public speakers, right? And other people not so much. And that's all okay. It's just being aware of where your strengths are, where your skills are, because that's what you can lend to being an advocate. You may not be a great speaker, but you might be a fabulous writer, or you might be a fabulous collaborator, and you're good and creative with coming up with different ideas. Lean into those to help you with your advocacy. And then, to kind of end on that quote where no cape required. Absolutely no cape required. None of us are superheroes. I am not a superhero. It's a journey. And as you begin to advocate and get more comfortable advocate, you'll grow and your journey will expand, but still, no cape required, no superhero, mentality needed there. I think it's something that everyone can do, and they can do it in their own way.
And there's various ways you can find others to join. So you can be advocating as an individual. You could be advocating with a group, whether it's a nonprofit. I know you yourself serve on several boards of nonprofits. And so those organizations are advocating in different areas as well.
That's right. That's right. And, for me, board service has been a hallmark of my career. As soon as I graduated from law school and got out into the quote unquote real world with a job, I got appointed to my first not-for-profit board. And goodness, from there up until now, I think I took 1 year where I had a board break, but I served on at least 2 boards any given year. And in my career, I've served on about a dozen different boards, which has been a real honor and a learning experience for me. But it's also a good place where I've been able to use my voice to advocate.
So let's switch gears just a bit and talk about building the basics, the building blocks of advocacy. Yes, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, but what are just kind of the essential skills, and maybe even skills that if they are a bit of a weakness, you might want to strengthen them, or at least know that you'll need to use those skills to some extent?
Yes. So a few things that are important in terms of skills and skill building. So one is to really be clear on your objectives, right? So what is it that you're trying to accomplish, right, with your advocacy? Is it long-term? Is it a short-term gain, right? And this will help you with the types of strategies that you should use in order to advocate for that issue, right? So really think through, am I trying to change a law, right, which is huge and very long term, or am I trying to advocate for myself so that I can not sit in a wheelchair at an airport, right, which is relatively short term, right? So it's being able to assess those situations. Right. And then it's also being able to know what tools are in your arsenal. So one thing that is really important is to understand what your rights are in any situation. You don't need to be an expert in the law, but you do need to understand the different avenues. So if you're going to be traveling in airports, you should learn about the Air Carrier Access Act just broadly, right? And know that, you are not obligated to sit in a wheelchair. You do have the right to say no and take sighted guide if you want. Right? Like that is a right. So that's standing behind you. And you should also know that there are complaint resolution associates at every airport that you can call if something were to go wrong or awry. And those, vary from airport to airport. But you should have a general understanding of your rights, right? You should also have a general understanding of your capabilities, right? Again, going back to the awareness of your strengths and your weaknesses, right? So that you know and you don't get yourself in a situation that is above your means or too challenging, right? You want to know that you can actually advocate somewhat effectively. So you want to make sure that you have the right tools and backing behind you. Because like I said, if you're going to be doing something like trying to change a law, You probably don't want to go at that alone, right? You probably want to lean into your community, build support, and really make sure you have the right team behind you versus if you're in an airport, you can do that on your own. You don't need a group of folks behind you to do that. Another skill that you want to work on is your communication, right? Knowing how to articulate your issue, right? And how to explain your objective. And also practicing doing that in various ways, right? Sometimes you need to be really strong and firm. Other times you can be really friendly and kind of jovial and get exactly what you want. It goes back to that, catching more flies with honey than vinegar, but sometimes vinegar is required. Like, I don't know why we're catching flies anyway in that saying, but there are times when it makes sense to be really sweet and and you'll get what you want and, you'll still be advocating, right? But then there are times when, honey's not going to work and you're really going to have to lean into that vinegar and know your rights and express your rights to say, you know what, I have the right to do this. And part of it is discernment and practice, right? I cannot emphasize the practice part of this because you're not going to get it right the first time. You're not going to get it right every time. It's a muscle that you have to build. And the more that you advocate for yourself or for others, I don't want to say easier it gets, but the more comfortable you get with being able to voice those difficult things. The other thing that I think is important that kind of goes back to understanding the objectives is really understanding when are you going to walk away or when are you going to go for an alternative path, right? Because you're not going to win every single, I don't want to call it fight, but advocacy moment, right? You're not going to win every single one of those moments, but you do have to have a plan for what's my plan B or what's my next step in this path. So being really, really thoughtful and learning how to, think before you act so you're not reacting. Right? You're actually advocating. And I think that's a big difference, right? When you're reacting to something, you're just in the moment, responding in whatever way, right? It could be an emotional way, it could be rational, but generally when we're responding in things like that, it's not necessarily rational, it's not necessarily strategic, right? And that's okay, that's gonna happen. Sometimes we react, things happen, and sometimes we react. But if you're planning to advocate, it goes back to the same thing that you and I were talking about, Kim, where you're planning to go to study abroad, and you've got to plan this out. It's a thoughtful process when you're advocating. Sometimes you just decide to do it one day, but if you could decide to do it continuously, you want to plan and kind of think through and say, what's my best approach in this situation? And that helps you build your toolkit for the next time and the next time after that.
How does empathy play a role when you're advocating?
Empathy is key. I actually think that's probably one of the strongest things that you can use, and one thing that has been extremely helpful to me in my advocacy. So really understanding the point of view of the person that you're trying to either persuade or influence, right? So you've got to be clear on your, approach and strategy and all of that and what your objectives are and your strengths. We talked about all of that, right? That's great. You got to understand yourself, but then you've got to put your shoes, you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're going to be, talking with or talking to about whatever issue it is. You've got to understand, where are they coming from, right? What are some of the challenges that they might have in granting your desire, right? Are there things that they might not be able to do? And really, giving a chance, even when you're advocating, one is listening to them. Right. So, state your point, say, hey, here's what's going on for me. And I really need this, right? Whatever this is. And then stopping and listening, right? And saying, well, what's the challenge with that? Why are you unable to grant this request? Why can't you, how can I help you meet my needs? What's standing in your way, right? And understanding where they're coming from really can open a door, right? Because the person sees you not only as someone who's asking, demanding for something, even if it's your right, and I know that's a hard one, even if it's your right, they don't see you as just demanding that. They see you as, oh, they're actually reasonable. They care about me too. Let me see how I can help them, right? So that empathy and building that skill of being able to feel and experience what you feel and experience, but also that for the other person is so, so critical. And it really changes the dynamic from being combative and kind of a fight to being a collaborative problem solving endeavor, right? And that's what advocacy can actually be. It could be problem solving. It doesn't have to be combative. I know that is off-putting to many people when you say advocacy. Like, oh yeah, no, I don't want to fight. I don't want to get into those types of things. And if you are empathetic, right, for yourself or whoever you're advocating for, but also the person who's there to help you, if you can understand where they're coming and convey that empathy, that's when you move from the fight to the problem solving and let's find a way forward.
Right. Well, and I think at this point in time in our society and culture, with such deep divisions in different areas, even if you're advocating for something related to blindness or accessibility, it might not be on one of these big primetime hot button issues, but still, we tend to have now this very conflict-oriented way in our culture, and so being able to, and sometimes maybe that's needed, but being able to step back and listen, I think there's not as much of that anymore as there perhaps used to be.
Yeah, it's an important skill to be able to hear things, even when they're difficult or even when you don't agree with them, right? Just because you're listening doesn't mean you agree, right?
No.
And when you're listening to understand where the other person is coming from, that's actually really powerful for them, right? Because most people don't get listened to in that sort of way. And for you, right? Because it gives you an insight into where they're coming from and where they're willing to give a little, right? Like it's a very, very powerful tool. So listening and then responding, right? Like listening, acknowledging where they're coming from. Like, oh, I get that. I get how it's hard for you to be able to provide me with this service that I need, right? And then so how can we do that? Right? How can we do that? And that sort of dialogue is so, so powerful.
And by listening, you may have a better idea of which tactics, if you're leaning towards honey or if you're leaning towards vinegar.
That's
with
right.
That particular
That's
person.
Right. They will tell you. They will choose. I would tell you that they will choose and let you know which one you should pull out of your back pocket.
Yeah, for sure. Are there other, I know you mentioned like in the airport, like knowing what your rights are and certain laws. Are there other key laws or regulations if a person or a group is advocating for accessibility, advocating for things related to their blindness or vision loss?
Yes. So the biggie, of course, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. That is an important one. You should know your rights under that. And it extends to private sector, public sector, and employment. So you do have rights under there, including the right to reasonable accommodations. So that's an important one. I encourage you to check out your local ADA center. They're actually, if you're in the U.S., we have them all across the U.S. You can go to adacenter.org and look things up there. They have some really nice, handy, easy, digestible guides and tips on rights under the ADA. Another one is the Rehabilitation Act, right? So if you're in education and those spaces, you may want to take a look at that one and understand what your rights are when it comes to the federal government. And then I did mention the Air Carrier Access Act. That's for transportation travel on airlines. Those are probably the three big ones. And then, of course, when it comes to housing, the Fair Housing Act also covers some rights and responsibilities under housing. Those are the biggies. But Again, you don't need to be an expert, right? You don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need to understand all of the regulations. And really, what you need to know is that there is law behind you, right? The general purpose of the law is that so all folks, including folks who are blind and visually impaired, can have reasonable access and reasonable accommodations and support so that they can be members of society, right? Like that's not, unreasonable, right? And that's kind of the gist of all of these laws. You don't need to go in, armed to the teeth, ready to cite, provisions and regulations and all of that.
Right.
That's the vinegar. That's the vinegar, right? Sometimes you need to pull out the vinegar, right? Or get someone else to pull out the vinegar. The honey is like where you want to at least start to know that if you're out there trying to like persuade and advocate and influence on your own behalf, you don't need to cite the laws. All you really need to know are that there are laws out there supporting you, right? But you can build advocacy bridges through relationships, right? And through relationship building. That's an important thing to remember as well.
And that there are other support networks and groups and things that can also help you.
Absolutely. Yes. You're not alone in this. So one of my favorite quotes, Kim, is, and I don't know where it comes from. It's like this just proverb that's attributed to unknown, but it's, you can do it, but you can't do it alone. Right. And I love that quote for so many reasons. But one of them is just what you said is that, like you can have a voice, right? And you can make a difference. And there are certain things that, other people can't do. And that's for you to do. But you can't and you don't have to, more importantly, do it alone. You can lean on your community and all different sorts of communities, the BVI community, obviously the legal community. There's all different places to gather support and to, pull things together and all these different tools and skills around advocacy to make a difference. So I just love that one. You can do it, but you can't do it alone.
Are there any other specific tips that you want to share in terms of starting an advocacy effort? Obviously, you said you need to know what issues are important to you, but if you've identified something, initial steps to take.
Yes. So if you've identified an issue, right, and you're ready to advocate and you're passionate about the particular issue and you've done your due diligence and your research to really understand the issue, that would be the first step, right? So making sure that you have all of that behind you, that you understand the issue, that you understand the key players in the issue, right, is the next step, is who is it that you need to talk with or meet with or communicate with, right? And it could be all different ways. It could be through writing or an actual meeting or a phone call or a Zoom call or whatever it is. But who are the key players, right? That's when you want to understand. And you want to understand, okay, so what are some of the factors? This goes into the empathy piece. What are some of the factors that they might be considering? This is all of the planning and preparation, like as you're deciding, okay, how do I approach this? And then how do I go into it? So, identifying the issue, making sure you've done the research and due diligence on it, finding the key players, right? Because you don't want to nibble around the edges. You want to find out who's the decision maker, right? And what's your path to getting to them. And then after all of that research and all that planning, that's when you go in and you start making your pitch and your approach. And obviously that may vary depending on what the particular issue is. Those are kind of the steps that I would advise. And then also, because sometimes, again, it's not going to be you doing it alone, who else do I need to bring in? Who else might be an ally on this issue and another important voice to have at the table? You might want to identify that and do some research around that before you start going in and advocating. And these are for bigger type issues. On the day-to-day stuff, right, that are the more short term, I actually encourage people to explore and experiment, right? Especially like one-off situations where like maybe you're negotiating with like an Uber driver, right, who doesn't want you to bring your guide dog into their car, right? And that can go all different types of ways, right?
Yes, for sure.
But that is generally a one-off where you're probably, unless you're in a small town, which some people do live in a small town like me, where you might know many of the Uber drivers, right? Those are generally one-off situations. So you can experiment and say, you know what, I'm going to try and be an aggressive, advocate right now and see how that works. Right? Or I'm going to be honey. I'm going to lay on the honey and see if I can get somewhere with this. You can start very, very small with advocacy. And that's what I encourage on the individual level is if you have these situations that come up where you might not see that person again, try out different, find where your style is, find where you're comfortable and see where you can get. And remember, you can try the vinegar, but keep it in, you want to keep that in the back pocket and pull it out when you really, really need it. But it's good to at least practice so you see how it feels. And then also experiment with the honey. If you're generally, pretty serious and stern and firm, try. What is it like to be a little bit more gentle, a little bit more collaborative, a little bit more open as you're advocating and trying to persuade and influence someone to give you what you need, right? Mm-hmm. And it really is generally things that we need, right? That's what we're advocating. Right. They're not wants, they're not, desires or nice to haves. I mean, you can certainly advocate for those too, but it's really about you need something and, how can you best get it?
In your experience, both personally and also as you've worked with others, I know you're a coach as well. What are the top challenges that you see individuals who are blind or have vision loss? I mean, there's always anyone advocating can face challenges, but are there challenges that a person with blindness faces that maybe I, as a sighted person, would not face just because of stereotypes and things? And how do you suggest people overcome those?
Yeah, there's a few things. And some of them are unique to individuals. And I went through this. So some of it can start off as not having the confidence, right? Just not feeling like you're ready to advocate, that you have your full footing. That can be a barrier and a challenge. And generally, and it's, I can't say it and have you fix it, but generally what that comes down to is you are worth it. Right? There are laws, and I said this earlier, but I'll say it again. There are laws behind you because your needs matter, right? So even if you don't feel confident the first time, know that there are many, many people that came before you and that came before me that laid down this foundation of rights and, access to opportunity, right? Like that is already there. So you're not the first one and you're not going to be the last one, right? So you are worth it and you deserve to have your voice heard, right? So that's one thing. It's just the confidence to be able to do it. And also, not being able to see someone that you're, trying to advocate to, that can be a little nerve-wracking. And part of that is, again, the confidence, getting really, really comfortable in your own skin and knowing that what you're asking for is not unreasonable, right? It's not unreasonable to have access and fair opportunity in this society. So that's one piece. Another piece that comes up that may impact blind and visually impaired folks more than others is, how do I say this? Because I do want to be honest and, really direct, but I also don't want to offend or stereotype, right? Because we're not a monolithic group. We have a wide range of personalities, backgrounds, differences, like all of that stuff within BVI. But sometimes there can be a tendency not to lean into empathy, right? Or not to have the opportunity to understand the wider world. So, right, so if you're sheltered, right? Like if you're not out there actually experiencing things and learning how to interact with people, that can be a hindrance. So what I mean by this is that, yes, when you're out there trying to advocate, people are going to see you differently, right? Some folks are going to see you as inspirational, right? Like, oh my goodness, it's so wonderful that you left your house and, went to the corner store to get your, whatever it is, right?
Walked across the street by yourself.
Exactly, yes. It's so inspirational. And those folks are going to be willing, like you're not going to do a whole lot of advocating for anything. The only thing you're going to advocate for is some space and independence to keep, living your life so you can move on and not, be fawned all over, right? So that's one thing that you're going to encounter. The other is kind of the pitying, like, oh, isn't that nice? Oh, they understand their rights, but I'm still not going to, like, not being taken seriously. That's another thing that can come up. And sometimes with that, it's about not being even more firm. Sometimes it's about toning down and kind of listening and tuning in to the other person, right? To see, to be able to understand how you're connecting with that person. But there are loads and loads of stereotypes that happen and different encounters. So like even with me, now, after being blind for decades and being an advocate for decades, there are times when I enter a room and I may have a colleague with me who's sighted, and guess who gets talked to? Like, guess who the person talks to, right? And so, that still happens to me, even when I'm advocating for, large swaths of people other than myself. Like, they don't see me as the one with the power or the decision-making authority. And there are ways to very nicely and easily shift that back. That makes the person feel a little uncomfortable, but not in a bad way, kind of like a, oh, whoops kind of way. So, lots of times when that happens to me, when, a sighted person talks to another sighted person that I'm with instead of talking to me, I'll play along and translate. I'll say, oh, to my sighted colleague, I'll say, oh, could you please let them know that, that's perfectly fine. And then, all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, okay, we see what's happening. And they realize, oh, wait, I can talk directly to Angela.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Angela, I just appreciate all this information that you've given us, and just to encourage folks to advocate for themselves in those individual everyday moments, as well as for causes and rights that are important to them. They may be related to blindness and vision loss. They may not. They may be advocating for other things, but as a blind person. So is there any just last words or mantras? I know you shared you can do it, but you can't do it alone. Is there anything else that you would like to share in closing with our listeners?
So, yeah, I think it's actually kind of where you ended with, you can advocate for all sorts of things, right? Not just blind and visually impaired specific issues, but more broadly. And I think that's a really kind of important place to land. And most of us know this, like, we are blind and visually impaired, and we may be part of the community, but that's not all that we are, right? There's so much more to who we are. We have interests and desires and hobbies and maybe jobs and families. Like, there's much, much more, and so many dimensions to who we are. And you can choose to advocate in any one of those areas, right? You don't have to be the voice for all blind and visually impaired people. You can be the voice for yourself, right? And that's okay. And that's good. Like, advocacy is this really flexible tool that you can use in all sorts of ways. And by doing that and kind of building that skill and muscle, you'll be helping not only yourself, but people that come after you. And you'll also be opening the eyes of the people that you're interacting with. So there's a lot of good that comes from being an advocate. And again, using that voice, giving voice to things that people don't often think about. There's so much power and good that comes from that, from, big things, small things, it all kind of ripples out. So I am just thrilled and honored again to, be with you and to, share a few of my thoughts on this, but I'm even more thrilled and excited that you're doing this series all around advocacy because it's a critical skill. And I just, really applaud you and your team for putting this series together.
Oh, well, thank you. If folks would like more information about you or about the coaching and the other services that you provide, where do they find you?
They find me at angelawinfield.com. That's ANGELAWINFIELD.com. All my information is there. You can reach out, and you can also connect with me on LinkedIn.
Super. Well, next week, we'll be continuing on with the second in our series of advocacy and talking about self-empowerment. So we'll be diving a little bit deeper into that individual advocacy, advocating for yourself. So be sure to join us for next week's episode. Angela, thank you again. We so appreciate it. And I just remind all of you as listeners to subscribe to our podcast. There may be other podcasts. We also have Blind Sight, Blind Level Tech, and The Blind Chick are three of our other podcasts that AfterSight produces. So be sure to check those out as well. You can share the podcast or leave a review, and that's always really helpful to us. So thank you for listening, and I hope that the information we provided today help you to navigate your life with vision loss.